Jamaica, Easter Sunday, 1760. While white planters gathered in prayer and celebration, a different kind of ritual was unfolding in the shadows. Hundreds of enslaved men and women, their hands hardened by cane fields, gripped machetes not as tools, but as weapons. At their head was Tacky, once a proud Akan leader, now a slave turned general. When dawn broke, laughter turned to screams, hymns to silence. 60 masters fell before the sun had fully risen. This was not Easter morning, it was the birth of rebellion. In the 18th century, Jamaica was the glittering jewel of the British Empire, but its brilliance was paid for in blood. Sugar was not merely a commodity, it was currency, it was empire, it was obsession. Every crystal that sweetened English tea was born from endless hours of labor beneath the Caribbean sun. The island had become the engine of Britain's sugar revolution, its fields stretching endlessly like seas of cane swaying under a merciless sky. To keep this empire running, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were torn from their homelands and forced into bondage. Ships carried them across the Atlantic, branding them as cargo, stacking them like goods. By the time they staggered onto Jamaican soil, many were broken in body but not in spirit. Among them were the Akan people, warriors and farmers from the Gold Coast, whose culture and discipline had long been forged by battle. Life on the plantations was a sentence without reprieve. 16 hours a day bent over cane, blades cutting into hands, sweat stinging wounds, overseers' whips cracking like thunder. Nights brought no comfort. The small wooden huts where families huddled were suffocating, shadows thick with sorrow. Death was common. Disease, exhaustion, punishment. For many, life expectancy barely stretched beyond a decade after arrival. But oppression breeds more than despair. In the silence of night, stories were whispered, legends of African kings, tales of warriors who refused to kneel, songs of rivers and forests that still lived in memory. Around firelight, elders reminded the young that chains could shackle the body but never erase the soul. The British masters believed they had broken their captives into compliance, yet beneath the cane fields lay a different reality, a simmering fury, an unbroken will. The very tool the slaves used to harvest the machete was itself a silent reminder. It cut cane by day, but in their minds, it could cut chains by night. The island was a paradise for those who owned it, purgatory for those who sustained it. Sugar wealth built palaces in London, but on Jamaican soil it built gallows. In this crucible of cruelty, rebellion was not merely possible, it was inevitable. And among the Akan, whose memories of leadership and war had not faded, a figure would rise, someone who carried not only the scars of slavery, but also the discipline of a warrior past. His name was Tacky. Before he was a slave, Tacky was a leader. In West Africa, he had been a chief among the Akan, a man who understood the language of loyalty, the rhythm of war drums, the strategies of resistance. His capture and sale into slavery was not just the breaking of a man, but the attempted breaking of a nation's spirit. The British believed they had reduced him to property, but the lion caged still remembered the hunt. The Akan were no strangers to conflict. On the Gold Coast, they had fought rival kingdoms, defended villages, and mastered tactics of ambush and discipline. Tacky carried this heritage within him, like embers hidden beneath ash. Though forced to cut cane, he measured the plantation as a battlefield. The watchtowers were enemy outposts, the cane knives potential swords, the overseers predictable in their arrogance. Every command barked by a master reminded him not of submission, but of the foreign chains around his wrists. He watched, he listened, he learned. While others saw hopelessness, he saw weakness in the system, moments of lax guard, the complacency of owners during holidays, the reliance on small garrisons spread too thin. To the enslaved who labored beside him, Tacky was more than another field hand. He was a figure whose bearing betrayed something greater. His posture was upright, his gaze steady, his words laced with quiet authority. Around fires at night, when whispers passed of freedom and vengeance, Tacky's presence lent those whispers weight. An enslaved man who had once been a chief carried a memory of command, and memory can be more dangerous than any weapon. For the British, the cane fields were sites of profit. For Tacky, they were terrain waiting for revolt. He knew that machetes were not just agricultural tools, they were blades. In his mind, he rehearsed the transformation, from harvest to war. If the island was a prison, then it was also a stage for rebellion. Every day of forced labor was a lesson in patience, endurance, and observation. The lion crouched in silence, but silence was not surrender. Tacky's spirit was proof that the Atlantic had not washed away identity. The Akan drumbeat still echoed, though faintly, beneath the crack of the overseer's whip. And in time, that drum would call others to rise, to strike, and to reclaim dignity with blood. By the late 1750 seconds, Jamaica was a furnace waiting for a spark. The empire's wealth had swollen, but so too had the cruelty that sustained it. Whips cracked louder, punishments grew harsher, and overseers wielded unchecked power. Rumors spread of men lashed until their backs were ribbons, women taken in the night, children born into chains before they even touched the earth. To live enslaved was to breathe despair, yet despair does not always kill. It can ferment into something far more dangerous. In the small cabins that dotted the cane fields, whispers stirred. By day, silence reigned, overseers watching like hawks. But by night, when the moon hung low and firelight flickered, voices grew bold. The Akan spoke in their native tongue, reviving fragments of chants and battle cries. Stories of past rebellions, both failed and triumphant, traveled from plantation to plantation. Each tale was a reminder that chains had been broken before and could be broken again. The British masters remained oblivious, trusting in their routines. Easter approached, and with it came indulgence. Planters prepared feasts, drank deeply, and let vigilance slip. In the minds of the enslaved, the holiday of resurrection took on a darker meaning. Easter would not only commemorate Christ's rising, it would mark the rising of the oppressed. Tacky understood timing. A leader knows that revolt is not simply fury, it is calculation. The island was stretched thin with soldiers. Many were stationed elsewhere, guarding ports or suppressing smaller disturbances. In the cane fields, the masters were confident, unguarded. The machetes, plentiful and sharp, were always at hand. And most crucially, unity was within reach. All across the island, enslaved men and women carried the same weight, bore the same scars. What one felt in the east was mirrored in the west. Suffering had become their shared language. And now, a leader emerged to translate that suffering into action. For years, rebellion had been little more than a dream, murmured in darkness. But as 1760 approached, that dream hardened into resolve. Tacky whispered to chosen allies, gathering warriors not by proclamation but by secret nods and glances. The plan was clear: strike at dawn, when shadows were long and vigilance low. Strike when the masters celebrated resurrection, never imagining that their own end was near. The island was boiling, and the lid could no longer hold. The morning of the 7th of April, 1760, began not with hymns, but with silence, heavy as ash. The sky was still dark, the air cool, the roosters crowing against a tension unseen. On one side of the island, church bells would soon call planters to prayer. On the other, hundreds of enslaved men and women prepared to write their own gospel in steel and fire. Tacky stood at the forefront, his figure framed by first light breaking the horizon. In his hand was a machete, gleaming faintly in the dim. For years, it had been the tool of cane harvest. Now it was transfigured into a weapon of liberation. Behind him, warriors gathered, their breaths visible in the dawn chill, their eyes burning with something fiercer than fear, resolve. The first step was bold and calculated. They marched to the local fort, where a cache of muskets and gunpowder lay under the guard of only a handful of soldiers. The attack was swift. Overseers, unprepared for such audacity, fell quickly. By the time the sun edged above the horizon, the fort was theirs, the store of weapons in rebel hands. The sound of chains rattling had long defined their days. Now the crack of gunfire declared a new order. With machetes raised high, they descended on the surrounding plantations. The masters, many still in their beds or gathered for Easter meals, were caught between disbelief and terror. The songs of prayer that drifted from chapels were drowned by battle cries in TWI, Akan voices rising like drums of war carried across the Atlantic. For the enslaved, this was no longer a life of submission, it was a battlefield reclaimed. The machete strikes were not only blows against flesh, but against centuries of domination. Each swing cut deeper than cane, it severed fear, it carved the possibility of freedom. The Easter dawn, meant for celebration, became the island's reckoning. A tide had turned. For the first time, Jamaica's planters realized their empire was not unshakable. The enslaved had awoken, and they carried with them the memory of Africa and the fury of the oppressed. This was not just rebellion, it was resurrection. The first hours of Tacky's rebellion unfolded with the precision of a storm long in the making. By the time the sun rose higher into the Jamaican sky, over 60 planters and overseers lay dead. They had been drinking, feasting, or still tangled in sleep, never imagining that the very hands which once bowed before them would rise in vengeance. The machete was a farmer's tool, but in these moments it became a symbol of reversal, where once it cut cane under compulsion, now it cut through the fragile armor of the master's complacency. The overseers who had barked orders fell silent. The laughter that had rung out in great houses during Easter revels was extinguished, replaced by the chilling stillness of death. It was not wanton slaughter. To the rebels, each strike was deliberate, each act infused with memory of lashes endured, of kin stolen, of dignity stripped away. In the quiet aftermath of those first attacks, it was not jubilation that filled the air, but a kind of stunned silence. Liberation was never clean. The price of freedom had always been blood. News traveled quickly. From plantation to plantation, whispers grew into cries. Tacky had struck, the Akan had risen. Enslaved workers who had never met him nonetheless felt his presence in the air, as if the island itself shifted beneath their feet. The British settlers, for so long untouchable, were suddenly vulnerable. Imagine the terror of the planters as they realized that their world could crumble in a single morning. They had built an empire on the belief that submission was eternal. Now, submission had turned to defiance, and defiance to action. For the enslaved, those 60 deaths were not just numbers, they were the first cracks in a fortress that had seemed impregnable. To kill a master was to kill the myth of his invincibility. It was proof that the Atlantic had not stripped Africans of their warrior past, that their spirit could not be buried under cane and chains. The Easter dawn became a threshold. Beyond it lay uncertainty, victory, or annihilation. But for one brief moment, the balance of power shifted. The enslaved were not merely laborers, they were soldiers, reclaiming dignity. And the ground of Jamaica drank deeply of blood, both as curse and consecration. The rebellion did not stay contained. Like fire racing through dry cane, it leapt from estate to estate. The machetes of the first wave were joined by stolen muskets, powder, and flame. Smoke rose across the hills, curling black against the blue sky, a grim signal that the enslaved had taken their stand. What set this rising apart was its unity. It was not a lone act of defiance, but a collective movement, guided by Tacky's memory of Akan discipline. Warriors marched in loose formations, their chants in TWI echoing across valleys. To hear those chants was to hear Africa itself roaring back to life on Caribbean soil. Plantations that had seemed eternal were suddenly vulnerable. Storehouses burned, cane fields smoldered, and planters fled in terror. The sight of the Akan flag, improvised yet potent, fluttering over rebel-held ground, struck deeper fear than any weapon. It was not merely cloth. It was the declaration that the enslaved carried with them another homeland, one not yet extinguished. For those who joined, it was more than rebellion. It was recognition that the chains they bore were not natural, that resistance was a birthright. Enslaved men and women left fields, kitchens, and cabins to take up arms. Some brought their children in tow, refusing to let the next generation grow under the whip. Hope is contagious, and in those early days of April, Jamaica pulsed with it. Across the island, hundreds who had never seen Tacky nonetheless marched under his cause. His name became a summons, whispered with urgency, carried like wind through cane rows. Freedom, now. But fire cannot spread unchecked without drawing eyes. The British masters who survived regrouped. Letters raced across the colony. Soldiers were recalled, militias roused. Soon, the empire would respond with overwhelming force. Yet for a fleeting span, the enslaved held more than fields. They held the vision of what Jamaica could be without chains. The rebellion was no longer an ember, it was an inferno. The British Empire could tolerate whispers, even small sparks of rebellion. But what Tacky ignited threatened the very foundation of Jamaica, the empire's richest colony, the jewel of its sugar crown. News of 60 planters dead, of forts raided, of plantations burning, spread like wildfire through the colonial elite. Shock quickly hardened into resolve. The empire would answer not with negotiation, but with overwhelming force. Within days, thousands of troops were mobilized. White militias, armed with muskets, scoured the countryside, their red coats flashing like sparks against the green cane fields. But more chilling was the deployment of the black shots, enslaved men, conscripted and armed by the British, ordered to hunt their own kin. To the planters, these black shots were indispensable. To the rebels, they were traitors. The embodiment of chains turned against themselves. The terrain became its own weapon. The rebels knew the forests, the gullies, the hidden marshes. They struck in ambushes, fading back into the wilderness, forcing the British to chase shadows. For weeks, the island was transformed into a war zone. Muskets cracked, machetes clashed, torches consumed the night. What had begun as a single blow now raged as a prolonged insurgency. Yet the empire's resources seemed endless. Where one garrison faltered, another arrived. Naval guns offshore threatened rebel strongholds, while cavalry trampled through cane fields. The planters, once trembling, regained confidence behind their armies. The rebellion's momentum, so fierce at dawn, began to waver under the sheer weight of Britain's machine. Still, the Akan warriors fought with a ferocity born not of strategy alone but of necessity. They were not simply fighting for victory, they were fighting for existence. Every battle carried the weight of ancestors, every ambush a refusal to vanish silently. Even as numbers dwindled, their resistance forced Britain to bleed resources and reveal its own fragility. But the empire was patient. It could lose skirmishes so long as it won the war. Slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. Camps were discovered, leaders betrayed, supplies cut. For the rebels, hunger became as dangerous as musket balls. The war of machetes and muskets, of shadows and fire, reached its crescendo, and at its heart stood Tacky, lion of the Akan, refusing to kneel even as the empire's jaws closed in. Weeks of struggle bled into months. The rebellion, once unstoppable, now faltered under betrayal and exhaustion. British scouts and black shot trackers pressed deeper into forests, guided by knowledge wrung from captured rebels. The empire would not rest until its most dangerous foe lay silent. It was in the rugged hills near Port Maria that Tacky's end came. Surrounded, pursued, and cut off, he refused surrender. To yield would have meant chains, humiliation, a trial designed not for justice, but for spectacle. For a man who had once been a chief, once commanded loyalty and war cries, such an end was unthinkable. Accounts vary in detail, but all agree. Tacky was brought down by musket fire. Some say he fell in open combat, defiant until his last breath. Others claim a single shot from a black shot pierced him. Irony and tragedy intertwined. What is certain is that his body was seized and his severed head displayed publicly mounted high, a grim warning to any who dared imagine freedom. For the British, it was meant as closure. A rebellion crushed, its leader silenced, its lesson engraved in terror, but symbols can betray their makers. The sight of Tacky's head did not erase his memory, it preserved it. For every enslaved man and woman who saw that grotesque display, it was not just defeat they witnessed, but defiance carved into history. The lion had fallen, but the echo of his roar lingered. His death did not extinguish the fire, it scattered embers. Other uprisings would follow in Jamaica and across the Caribbean. Each would draw, in part, from Tacky's example that freedom was worth blood, that no chain was unbreakable forever. The empire celebrated its victory, but beneath the triumph lay unease, for in killing Tacky, they had not killed the idea he carried. Ideas do not hang on gallows, nor rot in cages. They travel, whisper, ignite. Tacky's fall was the empire's warning, yet it was also Jamaica's seed of remembrance. The rebellion ended, but the island did not return to peace. Instead, Jamaica sank into a season of vengeance. British authorities moved swiftly to make examples of the captured. Hundreds of rebels were executed, some by hanging, others by the slow torment of fire. Those suspected of sympathy were whipped, branded, or mutilated. The empire needed not only to punish but to terrify, to remind every enslaved soul that resistance came with unbearable cost. Yet beneath this theater of cruelty, a deeper fear gnawed at the colonial mind. The planters had seen what they had long denied, that their world balanced on a knife's edge. A few hundred enslaved warriors had shaken the island, disrupted production, and forced the empire to pour thousands of soldiers into the conflict. What then, if rebellion erupted again, larger, better armed, more coordinated? The government responded by tightening its grip. Laws grew harsher, curfews were enforced, gathering in groups became a punishable offense. Even drums, once the heartbeat of African memory, were outlawed, for their rhythm carried the threat of communication and unity. Every element of life was watched, regulated, suppressed. But repression could not erase what had been witnessed. Among the enslaved, stories of Tacky's rebellion spread like underground scripture. They spoke of the dawn when planters fell, of the Akan flag rising, of machetes turned from tools into weapons of dignity. These stories were whispered in cabins, sung in fragments, carried forward to the next generation. The British sought to cast Tacky as a criminal, a murderer, a cautionary tale. Yet the enslaved remembered differently. To them, he was not a villain but a warrior who dared to strike. His fall did not bury hope, it kept it alive, flickering beneath the ash. In London, the rebellion was reported with alarm. Pamphlets spoke of the danger of Negro insurrection, and members of Parliament debated measures of control. But the mere fact that Britain's lawmakers had to speak of enslaved resistance revealed how deeply Tacky had unsettled the empire. Jamaica was no longer simply a sugar colony, it was a colony haunted by the possibility of revolt. The aftermath was bloody, yes, but also prophetic, for the Caribbean would not stay silent. Decades later, in Haiti, revolution would succeed where Tacky had fallen. The seeds sown in Jamaica would one day grow into storms that toppled empires. The masters believed they had ended the rebellion. In truth, they had only ended its first chapter. Tacky died, but his name did not. In Jamaica's hills and valleys, in cabins and cane rows, his memory survived. It traveled through stories, hidden songs, and whispered prayers. To the enslaved, he became more than a man. He became a symbol, proof that even under the weight of empire, defiance was possible. Legends grew around him. Some said his spirit roamed the forests where he once fought, guiding rebels who came after. Others claimed that on certain nights, the wind carried his war cry through the cane. Whether myth or memory, Tacky's presence refused to vanish. Colonial records attempted to define him as a traitor to order, a warning etched in violence. But history often reshapes what rulers try to erase. For the descendants of those who suffered, Tacky was no traitor. He was the echo of Africa on Caribbean soil, the roar of a lion even in chains. Centuries later, his name still stirs. In Jamaican folklore, he is remembered not as a failure, but as a pioneer, a man who dared to strike first. His rebellion may have ended in blood, but it opened the path for future revolts, each carrying a piece of his spirit. The empire could kill his body, sever his head, display it as a trophy of control, but it could not silence the idea he represented. And so we are left with the paradox. To the British, Tacky was a criminal. To the enslaved, he was a prophet of freedom. Which memory is true? Perhaps both. But truth, in the end, is less about what the empire wrote and more about what the oppressed remembered. As the Caribbean moved closer to emancipation in the centuries that followed, the shadow of Tacky's dawn lingered. His was not the last rebellion, but it was one of the first to shake the island so profoundly that the empire itself trembled. In the quiet reflection of history, one question remains. Can a man condemned as a criminal live on as a nation's hero? Tacky's story answers with silence and fire.